You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly podcast, and it's rather a special episode of the podcast today. We've got a special announcement to make. How exciting. And today's episode is basically about the special announcement that we're going to make and talking about that and how this will impact the podcast going forward. So basically, what we're announcing today on the podcast is that the Dibbly Dobbly podcast is on Patreon. So we've decided here at the Dibbly Dobbly podcast to launch a Patreon page. Now, many people know what Patreon is, but for those who don't know what it is, it's basically a website where you can pledge money and become a member and pledge money to whoever content creators that you like to follow and you'd like to show their support by pledging some money and becoming a member on Patreon and showing your appreciation towards them. And basically, nearly all YouTube channels have some sort of Patreon or some sort of pledging site where people can pledge money and become members and have access to perks and all that stuff. So basically, that's what we've done here at the Dibbly Dobbly podcast, is basically create a Patreon page. I thought, from my point of view, seeing that the community for the podcast has grown. Obviously, we've just crossed over 1,000 subscribers recently on YouTube, and seeing that the community is getting bigger and bigger, especially this year, it's gotten bigger. I decided to create a Patreon page basically to give all of you, our community out there, an opportunity to show your appreciation and support for the podcast in another way. And via Patreon, you can certainly do that. So that will be something that is going to be happening on the podcast. And look, before we go any further, we're not forcing people to become a member on Patreon. We're not forcing people to become a member. If you want to become a member, you can. But also you can show your support by subscribing and following us on our social medias. That support is more than enough, really. And I'm so grateful for that support as well. So you don't have to become a Patreon member. You can if you want. You don't have to. If you're already subscribed and following us on our social medias, that's more than enough support for me anyway. And I really appreciate that support regardless. But I thought by creating a Patreon page, it gives an opportunity for people to show their appreciation in a different form rather than by subscribing or following us on social media. So that's basically the bare bones about the Dibbly Dobbly podcast Patreon page. And we will talk about the membership perks and what you will get if you become a Patreon member of the Dibbly Dobbly podcast. We will explain that in this episode today. So now, if you become a Patreon member, now there's different tiers of membership on Patreon. For starters, for the Dibbly Dobbly podcast Patreon, we're only going to have one tier of membership. And we decided to settle on one tier at first. Maybe down the track, we may have different tiers of membership. But just to start off with, as we get into Patreon, let's just have one tier of membership, which have some perks that people can access for the podcast if you become a member of the Patreon, Dibbly Dobbly podcast Patreon. So basically, let's talk about Patreon membership. Now, basically, the tier of membership that we have already on the Patreon for the Dibbly Dobbly podcast is the Dibbly Dobbler. Not a bad name, isn't it? It's quite a cool name for the membership. Now, that's our only tier membership at this time. Now, basically, the Dibbly Dobbler. Now, you can become a Dibbly Dobbler Patreon member on the Dibbly Dobbly podcast Patreon page, basically. Now, let's talk about the Dibbly Dobbler Patreon membership what does it include in terms of the perks and certain things that you can have access to you if you become a Dibbly Dobbler Patreon member. Now, basically, as a Dibbly Dobbler member, you will receive the following perks for only $5 per month. If you pledge $5 per month on Patreon as a Dibbly Dobbler member, you will receive the following perks. Now, the first perk that you will get access to is early access to episodes on Patreon before they get released on YouTube, Anchor, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Your comments on episodes and live streams on YouTube will be the first ones to be replied and responded to first. Your name will be displayed on episodes and live streams on YouTube, and also displayed in the descriptions of all episodes and live streams on YouTube, plus on Anchor, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. The other perk is you can send in requests for us to do in terms of topics for us to discuss on our Cricket Ramblings episodes. You can send us requests for topics to talk about in our Cricket Ramblings episode if you become a Dibbly Dobbler member on Patreon. And also, last but not least, you can join us for live streams on YouTube and come and talk to me about cricket. So if you are a Dibbly Dobbler Patreon member, you can join me for a live stream. So if we're live streaming a particular match on the podcast, you can come on and join me to chat about cricket on the live stream on the podcast. That's another perk that you will have access to. So plenty of cool perks when you become a Dibbly Dobbler Patreon member. So those are just some of the perks that you will get when you sign up and pledge your membership to become a Dibbly Dobbler. So pretty cool perks. It's my way of thanking all of you who have shown tremendous support to me over the last 3 years of our podcast journey. It's my way to give you an opportunity to show your appreciation in a different way. As I said earlier, we're not forcing people to become a Patreon member. Your support is much appreciated, regardless if you're going to become a Patreon member or not. Your support is always appreciated, and I mean that sincerely. But I just thought it's another way to for people to show their appreciation towards the podcast, and really just to try something different, really. So plenty of cool perks. If you become a Patreon member, Dibbly Dobbler, if you become a member on Patreon, those are some of the perks that you will get if you become a member on Patreon. Now, the link to the Dibbly Dobbly podcast Patreon is in the description of this episode. So if you want to know where the Patreon page is for the Dibbly Dobbly podcast, we will leave a link to that in the description of this episode. All you need to do is just copy and paste the link, and then it will take you to the Dibbly Dobbly podcast Patreon page, and then you can pledge your membership and become a Dibbly Dobbler member on the Dibbly Dobbly podcast membership for Patreon. So the link to that will be in the description of this episode for you to join. Well, I think that's pretty much it for the announcement. So once this video is and this episode is up, pretty much the Patreon page will be up as well. And you can start showing your support and pledging your support towards the Dibbly Dobbly podcast. We have a fantastic community of people who love the game of cricket, who join us for the podcast and support us. So it's an opportunity for everyone to show their appreciation in a different way by becoming a Patreon member. As I mentioned earlier, you don't have to become a Patreon member. It doesn't really matter if you're a member or not. Your support is much appreciated anyway, as I mentioned earlier, regardless if you're a member or not on Patreon. But it gives another opportunity for people to show their appreciation in different ways. So that's pretty exciting. So make sure you check out our Patreon page. The link to that, as I mentioned, will be in the description of this episode. And we look forward to seeing many Dibbly Dobbler Patreon members join us and hopefully become members on Patreon, and hopefully we'll have access to many different perks that many people don't get to access when the podcast episodes come out. So it's something different, something new that we're trying, and hopefully people will get around to it. As I said, you don't have to be a member. Your support anyway is much appreciated, as always. So without further ado, thanks everyone for listening to today's episode and this announcement that we're starting a Patreon page. Do check us out on Patreon, but also if you haven't done so yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're over 1,000 subscribers, which is a fantastic achievement. I'm over the moon with that. And it just shows the support that we have from the community that we have here on YouTube, and also towards the podcast as well, which is fantastic. So do all those good things. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Also give our Facebook page a like as well and a share. And also the podcast is available on Anchor, Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts. So give us a listen on those platforms as well. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.